Chairman.
How's it going?
Good. Turn your mic on. Live.
All right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first 2023 Joint Study Committee on Service Delivery Strategy. And there's going to be a lot of strategic play in here. But before we get too strategic, I'm going to ask my colleague, Senator Max Burns, to open up with a little prayer, because I know sometimes that comes in handy whenever we're dealing with subjects like this.
If you'll join me, please. Father, we're grateful for opportunities, great opportunities that often are disguised as insurmountable challenges. We appreciate your guidance and your wisdom and your patience as we try to do what is best for the people of our great state. Open our ears and open our minds, and may we absorb the information and be in a position to make positive decisions. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Senator Burns. Let's start out with the real formalities. Said Chairman LaHood, would you like to introduce yourself, tell a little bit about
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator, again, and appreciate everybody for being here and all the conversations that have led up to this point. Looking forward to having this hearing where we can go on record with a lot of these conversations and ideas and bring solutions to the table. But John LaHood, I chair in the House the Governmental Relations Committee, and been doing that only for a year now. And but I've been in the House since 2018. So a lot of this subject matter, service delivery strategy, is I don't have a long history with it, but I've learned a lot in a short time, and like I said, look forward to hearing the ideas and solutions of our presenters today, and look forward to working with this committee of distinguished people, and doing a good job for the citizens of this state. So thank you, Senator, again.
Thank you, Chairman LaHood. Many of y'all know I'm Frank Ginn. Said me and Representative LaHood are co-chairing the committee. Said I tell people, I said I'm a recovering city and county manager, so I've been in those trenches before. Currently, I chair the State and Local Government Operations Committee in the Georgia Senate. But main thing is I got to sit in the front seat because somebody put my name up here. But John's going to take care of that in Valdosta, I know. And just so you know, is truly you live in the city limits of Valdosta?
No, outside the city limits.
In the unincorporated county?
Yep.
Okay, so we know which side he's on. So just saying. But I want to, if I can, ask all of our members, Mayor Norton, what is your target number down there? 14. I'm going to start with Mayor Norton, and just Dale, y'all come on up the way. We'll let everybody tell a little bit about where you're from and what you do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Derek Norton. I'm mayor of the city of Smyrna. I spend a lot of days down here in my other role as lobbyist for several different clients, but nice to have my mayor's role. My mayor's hat on today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this committee.
House District 144, which is north of Bibb County, a big part of Monroe, and a big part of Jones County. I am a former county commissioner. I was vice chairman of the county commission in Jones County, so I have a little bit of history with what we'll be looking at, but I'm looking forward to serving. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Representative Brian Prince. Well, I'm Brian Prince, a state representative out of House District 132, which is parts of Augusta, Georgia, which is Richmond County, but I have all of Jefferson County. So I have the rural and a little metro area. I have no experience in local government. My job is to stay out of it and help them. And seriously, what my job I see is enabling them to do what they need to do at their level from the state level. So I look forward to learning a lot here and hopefully being able to add some activity.
Hi, Senator Sheikh Rahman. I represent 5th Senate District in Gwinnett County, part of Lawrenceville, Northwest Tucker, Duluth, Lilburn. But glad to be part of this committee. We don't get to work with my House colleagues and the people like me. So it's a good opportunity for me to learn and see what's going on and try to contribute. And that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Max Burns, Senator Max Burns. I have the 23rd Senate District, which goes from Tolliver County, Crawfordville, one of the smallest counties and smallest cities in the state. I have Columbia, Richmond, McDuffie, Warren, Burke, Johnson, Jefferson, Glasscock, Emmanuel, Jenkins, and Scriven. So I have 11 counties. I have over 50 cities. My smallest city, I think, is 167. And then my largest is several hundred thousand. But I have to confess, I served on the county commission, and I was chairman of the county commission decades ago, but I'm glad to be here to work through this challenge. Thank you.
I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick on her, make her talk. Said just in case nobody recognizes it, the most important people in the room are the staff. They really make things happen, and I'm very fortunate to have Miss Emily Doppel as my administrative assistant at the Capitol. So, Emily, tell them a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name's Emily Doppel, and as Senator Reagan said, I'm his assistant. I also work for Senator Carton Summers, and I'm from Grayson, Georgia, but I moved to Atlanta a few years ago. So.
And got a big event coming up next month.
Oh, I get married next month.
All right, hey. We got you, John. I'm on the other side of the important staff here. Said on the front end, Molly, you got it. Oh yeah, you got us. Hey, if you don't say anything, we're gonna make it up.
Okay. Molly Aziz. I'm with the Budget and Research Office on the House side, and I'm also the analyst for Chair LaHood's Governmental Affairs Committee. So I'm around these issues a lot. Nice to be here.
Chris, I think you're up.
Molly, you did a great job.
Your button's not working, Chris. I don't know if you can push a button or something, but there we go. Try that one more time. Push that button one more time. Huh? Are you 5 or I think you're, there you go.
Is it on
Okay,
now?
You
Can
got
you hear me? So I'm Chris Dockery. I'm the chairman of Lumpkin County. Certainly an honor to serve on this committee. I'm looking forward to it. I was talking to several people that I know in the room before we started, and certainly got a good working relationship between ACCG and GMA, and I appreciate that. You know, we agree on about 90% of local government issues, so I know that we can all come together and reach some consensus on the other 10%. So certainly honored to be part of this committee, and I look forward to some great things. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Wesley Corbett. I'm Chairman at Large of Effingham County Board of Commission. My background is I was a CPA, retired from the CPA world several years ago. Managed the city for about 6 years and did their finances, and like I say, currently I'm the Chairman of the County Commission. So I hope bringing both sides to the table will help us find some resolve and resolutions that takes it out of our attorneys' hands and puts it back into the people who make these decisions. I'm looking forward to having some things that would really make life simpler for us as chairmen or as mayors to make these decisions and find equity for all of our constituents.
Kurt Ward, I'm in Brazelton, Georgia. I'm the mayor there. We cover 4 counties. I'm sure this will be discussed numerous times, but professionally I'm a lawyer. I represent a lot of small businesses, some professional athletes, do a lot of wealth management type consulting on that, and appreciate the chance to serve with each of you guys and ladies, for sure.
And I'll pick on them back there. Come on, Stuart, stand up and tell who you are.
Stuart Morelli. I'm with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I staff both of the chairman's committees, and I've got, before coming to the General Assembly, I spent 12 years doing local government law for a variety of cities and counties across the state of Georgia.
Sam White with Senate Press. You can't see Keenan, he's in the broadcast room, but he's my coworker, and we help handle the slideshows and the Zoom and everything like that. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Corbett. I'm with Senate Research, and it is always an honor to be here in whatever capacity we can serve.
Thank you. I think I got all our staff. Now, the reason that we've got to make sure we're on the mic is because we are actually Zooming somewhere out into Never Land. So 100 years from now, they can watch y'all. For me, I'm really impressed with the folks that we've got on the committee. Real pleased about that. One of the things that, as a guy that's worked both cities and counties, I recognize here in Georgia, I don't care where you live in Georgia, you're paying taxes to at least one local government, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4. And our job is to make sure that we're working to move Georgia forward and not always end in a feud. And unfortunately, this is a controversial subject. So that said, I'm going to turn the mic over to Chairman LaHood and let him kind of go down our agenda today and kind of what we've got going on. So, Chairman LaHood.
All right. Well, thank you. And again, thanks for all the introductions. And I'm glad we have such a experienced group of folks on the committee to help us. So, you ready to go ahead and get into the presentations?
I think so.
All right. So, first on the agenda, we've got representatives from GMA and ACCG. And if you want to come on up to the table, we'll let you introduce yourselves and get into your presentations. But what we're hoping is that you can give us all a deeper understanding of the service delivery strategy, its history, what it was created for. Where are we today with it, and how are things going around the state with the 159 counties and 530 something cities, and what are some things we can do to make this process go smoother and work better for the citizens of Georgia. So hope to hear some potential solutions today, and look forward to hearing from you. So we'll go ahead and start with Jim Thornton of GMA.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chairman LaHood, Chairman Ginn, members of the committee. I am Jim Thornton, Director of Governmental Relations for the Georgia Municipal Association. Honored to be with you today. I'm going to be joined in this presentation from GMA's perspective by our General Counsel, Rushi Patel, who is sitting right behind me. So we're going to be tagging in and out a little bit as we go through the presentation. I think ACCG is going to do something similar. Also delighted to have Ryan Bowersox and Kendall Daniels from our team with us today, and let Clint make an introduction, and then I will share an opening comment or so, and then we'll move right into the slideshow.
Thank you, Jim. Clint Mueller, I'm Governmental Affairs Director for ACCG. We represent the 159 county governments in the state. I've been with ACCG now almost 26 years, so this has been a topic that has been discussed all 26 years that I've been at ACCG, and it continues to be discussed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I was not around when it was created, and some of those that were around, I kid them about how did you all come up with some of these ideas, but it's been around for longer than I have. But at the end of the day, I think what's important here is that we all represent the Georgia constituents, and they expect government to work together. They expect government to be efficient, and that's what we're talking about today, is how do we create efficiencies at the local level of government. I just got back from a conference. We were in New Orleans and talking about doing things differently. That whole state's different. Everything they do in government's different from us. But we're very different when you look at the local government level and the way we operate from county to county and city to city across the state. And so I know we're going to talk about a lot of that today, but just keep in mind, I'm sure you're very familiar with how your area of the state works, but it can be very different in other areas of the state and how they operate.
Thank you, Clint. And yeah, just to piggyback off of that for a minute. So today in our presentation, we're going to start out with a fairly deep dive into the history of service delivery. As Clint mentioned, this has been around since I think 1997 as a statutory process in Georgia law. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of the evolution of that. We're going to focus on a few of the areas that seem to be recurring issues and that cause problems at the local level. And then we're going to end with a little bit of a teaser, I guess you'd say. We're going to talk about some ongoing work that GMA GMA and ACCG has underway, where we have actually been working, not reinventing the wheel, but we have been working on trying to find some ways to improve the service delivery negotiation process. And we probably won't have time today to get into a lot of those details, but hopefully at follow-up meeting, I think in Valdosta, we may have the opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into some of those. But this is intended to be a little bit more of background. We titled the presentation "In Search of Efficiency, Flexibility, and Equity," because what we're really talking about here is how can we improve the delivery of government services at the local level. And that is an issue that, as Clint alluded to, is typically between cities and counties, but I think it's also very critical that we always keep in mind the taxpayer, because ultimately the taxpayer is who's paying for the costs of the local government services. And so we want to keep that in the back of our mind. But we also recognize, as Clint says, that Georgia's a big state, Georgia's a diverse state, 159 counties, 536 cities, and throughout that diversity of the state, there are a lot of different solutions that make sense on the local level. The service delivery strategy already provides a flexible framework, and you're going to hear us talking about some of how that can be done in an individual context at the local level. I know some of you here, Clint and I are often saying that the context matters, and each individual county circumstance is a little bit different across the state. And then finally, I think just by way of a quick introductory comment, would say that for the most part, the negotiation process inside service delivery strategy works well. For the most part. Yes, there are flashpoints, and there are points of conflict, and there are points that lead to litigation that involve attorneys and consultants and others. But many of our counties and cities work through these processes on the local level because they do negotiate in good faith, and they are reasonable in trying to figure out what makes sense for the taxpayers in their community. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to share some examples of that as we go through what the process should work, how it should work. In the ideal scenario, how does the service delivery strategy bring together all the decision makers at the local level to the table to address how to most efficiently provide services, how to make sure that the people who are receiving the services are, as a general rule, the ones who are paying for the services that they're receiving. All of those issues that are built inside service delivery, that's going to be the focus of our presentation. And I think after this introductory comment, Clint and I are going to retire and let Rushi and Larry Ramsey come forward and go through the history.
So you're about to hear a little bit about the history, but before we get started with that, I just want you all to keep in mind when you're thinking about the framework of service delivery at the local level. So Georgia, we're maybe better than some states because we don't have townships. We know other states that, in addition to counties and cities, you got to deal with townships and some other forms of local government. In Georgia, it's pretty much counties and cities being the only general purpose local governments. However, we do have what we call special purpose government in Georgia. That's through like authorities. Actually, your school boards is also a special purpose type of government for schools. And so when you're thinking about services, the public is usually blind to who's providing it. They just want the service, right? So take water and sewer, for example. In my county, it's a water and sewer authority that's countywide that provides water and sewer. In some places, it may be the city government. In other places, it may be the county government through a special service district. Other places, it may be through the county through a countywide service district. And so that's where you're going to get into some of the complexities is county governments obviously are fulfilling a state function, providing services that the state needs to be done at the local level, but a lot of times they're also acting as cities in some parts of the unincorporated area and doing city-like services. And so that's where you get situations where what we call a city in one area of the state may be the county in a different area of the state, or it could be an authority. So those are, again, some of the complexities we'll get into, but at the end of the day, what's important, again, to the taxpayers is they're getting a service, regardless of who's providing it, and they're being taxed appropriately or paying fees appropriately for the service they're getting. So with that, we'll turn it over. Oh, I didn't mention Larry Ramsey is with me. Larry Ramsey is our general counsel. He can provide further introductions, but he used to be deputy general counsel at Fulton County. And then he went on to work for Girard and Davis, which is a law firm up in North Georgia that provides legal services for counties, cities, and schools across the entire state. So I think his time with Girard and Davis really exposed him to a wide variety of service provision across the state, since he had to work with local governments all across the state in that capacity. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rushi Patel. I'm the general counsel with the Georgia Municipal Association, and as Jim alluded to, I've been with at GMA for 13 years. Before that, I worked for the city of Brunswick, and I actually followed your esteemed legal counsel over here, Stuart, in that role. So I've been working for local governments for about 16 years now, and worked my way through GMA as a lobbyist / lawyer, and then mostly lawyer, and now back to lobbyist / lawyer. So I've heard a lot of service delivery issues, but I'll pass it to Larry for his input.
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, Larry Ramsey with ACCG. As Clint said, I've been doing this actually a lot longer than Rushi has, as you can tell from the gray hair. I spent many years working in-house with Fulton County, private practice, as well as Clint mentioned earlier, and been involved in a lot of these service delivery strategy disputes. And I will say, if there's any way to improve these processes that will benefit everyone in the state. As Jim said earlier, I think the vast majority of counties and cities work these out, that you don't really have conflicts. But for those that do, they become very protracted, very nasty, very expensive. And ultimately, as you all know, it's the taxpayers paying that bill, right? They're paying for those attorneys and consultants for these long, protracted disputes and service delivery strategy. And so I, even taking off my ACCG hat, just as a citizen, if there's ways that we can improve that through this committee and through legislation, I think that benefits the whole state.
And before I get into the next slide, I actually want to say, local government is a small world in Georgia. I followed Stuart with the city of Brunswick. An actually funny story is when I was interviewing to work at GMA, I happened to be interviewing at the same time with Fulton County, and I interviewed with this guy right here. So, it is a small world, so we all work together. In Georgia, we have the second most number, I believe, of counties and cities in the country behind Texas. And you don't hear bad stories from every city and every county, as you heard from Jim and Clint, as most of these negotiations do come to an agreement. You hear about the bad stories, though, and unfortunately, those tend to get the news. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the history of service delivery, just to give you a framework of how this came about, and what the laws currently say. So beginning with the history, these are kind of general statements because they're not true for every city and every county. But generally in the history of Georgia, cities existed, this is true, cities existed by charter throughout the state, and they still do exist by charter throughout the state. And most cities existed to provide urban services, such as things that you would think of you get from a city: police, fire, water, sewer, those sorts of things. A lot of cities provided those services, and you could not get them outside of the city limits. But that's not universally true. Counties historically and generally existed as an administrative arm of the state, and those counties existed to provide county courts, health and welfare services, bridge and road maintenance, agricultural services. Until the late 1960s, counties were known as the boards of roads and revenue, right? And so what ends up happening is there were significant changes in the state of Georgia, but not just in the state of Georgia, throughout the country in the middle part of the last century. And so particularly after World War II, you see things like the interstate system being built, a lot of funding going for education, like the GI Bill, a lot of funding going towards home ownership and things like that. So you had a lot of folks that were suddenly able to buy their own houses, and now they had an easier way to commute because of roads. And so we had these issues of people moving out of these dense urban cores and buying their own land out, typically in unincorporated areas right outside of the city. So the legislature started recognizing this problem in the late 1960s and early 70s, that there was an issue where folks were leaving urban cores of cities into unincorporated areas, and not all the time were they able to get the same services that they got in the city limits, but they still wanted those services. And so there were numerous study committees through this time period in the 60s and 70s that looked into this matter, and they realized that there was as one of these committees said, in terms of the quality of our environment, we are suffering from the effects of unplanned, uncoordinated, haphazard growth and development. So they realized they needed to do something about this. They needed to create some system where cities and counties could provide services that the residents wanted and that they were paying for. And so what ends up happening is you have a number of these service delivery study committees determining that there needs to be an equalization constitutional amendment that creates a level playing field for cities and counties to provide services. And so,
and just to add to that, so before the constitutional amendment that we're about to talk about, and to follow up on Rushi's comment, the way the General Assembly dealt with these issues of urbanization outside of city cores, growing population post-World War II, were a series of local acts and local constitutional amendments the General Assembly would pass, and then in the constitutional amendment context, the citizens would ratify. As you probably know, under the current Constitution, local constitutional amendments are not permissible, meaning an amendment that only applies, say, to a certain county or to a certain city. But before the 1983 Constitution, they were everywhere, and they were on the ballot every 2 years. And so one of the ways the General Assembly had responded to the issues Rushi pointed out were by proposing and having the statewide ratification of local constitutional amendments to provide certain services. So again, looking at my Fulton background, there were many constitutional amendments of local application that passed in the 50s that gave Fulton County certain municipal powers. But you had a hodgepodge throughout the state of these differing powers for different counties, different cities. And the study committees that Rushi talked about were looking at how do we come up with a more unified, cohesive system. So that led to what is sometimes called Amendment 19. As I mentioned, local constitutional amendments used to be a thing, and I can't imagine going to the ballot box and seeing dozens of constitutional amendments that you'd be voting on. It happened that this one was number 19 on the ballot in 1972. For all the voters to consider. And it was the outgrowth of the study committee that Rushi was talking about here at the General Assembly. And it proposed, and the voters then ratified in 1972, what is now referred to as the Supplemental Powers Clause of the Constitution. So Amendment 19 being the same thing as supplemental powers. And so for the first time, it granted statewide uniform authority to cities and counties to provide a list of services. You no longer had to go county by county, constitutional amendment by constitutional amendment to see what those powers might be. There was a series of listed right there in the Constitution to allow counties and cities this equalized list of services that they could all provide without needing separate authority from the General Assembly. So in a minute I'll run through, you'll see some of the services are listed. It's a long list. But the core structure of the supplemental powers provision is that it says that cities and counties can provide this list of services, and for cities, their core jurisdiction is within city limits, and for the counties, their core jurisdiction is the unincorporated area for this list of services. That amendment also says those can be changed in a couple of ways. The General Assembly, by other law, can change who's providing what service where, or those local governments can reach by intergovernmental agreement a different arrangement. And that happens a lot throughout the state where a county may by contract be providing a service within city limits and vice versa, where a city's providing services outside of city limits.
And before we start going through this list of the supplementary powers, it's important to note that this list is a long list of services, but when you're talking about service delivery strategy, that is a separate state law that we'll talk about in a minute. And this list of services is a limited list compared to what cities and counties negotiate on service delivery strategy. So when you look at a service delivery strategy agreement, you may see dozens of services, and you'll see services that are not listed in the supplementary powers clause.
No, that's a great point, because the introductory language of this constitutional amendment is that it's supplementary to any other powers that counties and cities may have or that may be delegated to them by the General Assembly. And there are plenty of examples where the General Assembly has altered under its authority here to alter the service delivery of certain services by counties and cities. Quickly, again, it's a long list, but you'll see police and fire, garbage, trash disposal are listed, public health facilities, EMS, animal control. Animal control is one that seems to pop up a fair bit about as a disputed issue. Street and road construction and maintenance, curb sidewalks, parks and rec, stormwater, sewage, water treatment, potable water treatment type services, housing, transportation, libraries. So again, it's a long list of services. Code enforcement is something that most local governments are involved in. Again, so the idea was we're going to lay out a lot of services. These are not mandatory. They are optional that cities and counties can provide these. This is an authorizing amendment to allow cities and counties to get into these lines of service business if they so choose, but they're not mandated to do so. Special districts clause, I'm happy to speak on that also. So also at the same time that the supplementary powers clause was ratified in the early 70s, as part of that same process, same committee process that led to these amendments, another provision in the Constitution was ratified to allow the creation of special districts for the to raise revenue for and provide services within these geographic areas that might be different than the borders of the jurisdiction itself. So you can think, for example, of a county that might have a special fire district that's only providing that service within a certain part of the county. They were given this constitutional authority. The General Assembly can create special districts, as it often has, for example, with sales taxes, but counties and cities also have the power to adopt special districts to fund and provide certain services within less than their full jurisdiction.
And one thing I'll note with the special districts clause, you'll notice the second bullet point here says fees, assessments, and taxes may be levied and collected by general law requiring the creation of districts with conditions, and by local ordinance. So there's choices there, but in that first thing you'll see fees, assessments, and taxes. And what you'll notice in the Service Delivery Strategy Act when we get to that is that the Service Delivery Strategy Act will sometimes use similar but not identical language to the Special Districts Clause, which unfortunately can sometimes cause disputes. So,
Right. So what happened after the Supplemental Powers Clause was adopted in '72? There was some litigation that ensued out of DeKalb County in the mid-'70s, and the issue there was some citizens argued that this constitutional provision meant that counties could not tax city residents for services that were being provided just in the unincorporated areas. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not what the Supplemental Powers Clause is about. It's an authorization to provide services, and while citizens were constitutionally entitled to be equally taxed, that the uniformity of taxation was on the assessment side, individuals are not entitled to equal benefit from taxes that are levied. And of course, that's true of any tax system, right? You know, income tax at the state level, not everyone gets a dollar for dollar return on the way that the state chooses to spend those dollars. And this was true for local governments under this supplementary powers clause as well. So it was about equal assessment, but didn't require equal benefits to citizens throughout the county.
And it really what Larry is talking about is where you first start seeing some consternation from city residents, because whether they know it or not, city residents throughout the state of Georgia are also residents of whatever county they live in. So they're not just city residents, they're county residents. So they are paying whatever city taxes and they're paying whatever county taxes. And so that decision that Larry is talking about starts causing consternation, because these city residents are saying, well, we're paying for city services and now we're also paying for county services. And how does that work? And so then you start seeing a lot of disputes and issues starting to be raised. And mind you, the Supplementary Powers Clause was passed in 1972. We were still on the 1945 Constitution in Georgia. We had another Constitution passed in '76, and then our current Constitution was passed in '83. So you have 72 until the 90s when these disputes and discussions are going on. And then in the early 90s, you start having new study committees, and you start having the governor putting together a task force. It was Governor Miller at that time, and I think in '92. And then you have more study committees being put together in the mid and late '90s about how are we going to address these disputes between cities and counties on service delivery. So then in 1997, you have the Service Delivery Strategy Act enacted by the Georgia General Assembly. It was House Bill 489. And basically that act was intended to try to address some of these issues. It's not meant to be a fix-all for everything, but it's meant to allow for this negotiation process. And so we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as Rushi said, 1997, this act is adopted by the General Assembly. It's interesting in the kind of introductory language, the General Assembly said the intent here is to allow for a flexible framework, and I think you'll hear that throughout the day. And as you've heard from Clint and Jim earlier, you have a lot of variation around the state, and that's consistent with the Act's goal of providing flexibility, to put some guardrails around the processes and funding of services, but to not dictate a particular outcome. So the Act says we want to allow for concise, efficient agreements among local governments to provide on the way that services are provided in a rational manner, to talk about how those services are funded and where they're geographically located. Again, so this was 1997. I think so. The first round of service delivery strategies, I think they were due by sometime in 1999. So that was the first round where cities and counties had to go through this particular process. I don't know if you want to.
The basics of SDS are you're having a negotiation between cities and counties. Now, not every county has multiple cities. Sometimes a county might have one city. There are a few counties that don't have any cities, I believe. Or is it? I don't know how many there are. One.
Now they're
okay.
Consolidated.
Okay. And so that's the who. The what is the service definition per Constitution, statute, and regulation. So it's not just limited to supplementary powers that we were talking about earlier. It's whatever services the cities and counties are providing. The Service Delivery Strategy Act calls for there to be a comprehensive plan. You'll notice that the chapter that the Service Delivery Strategy Act is split into two parts. The first part is the comprehensive planning part. The second part is the SDS Act itself. The where is the geographic area. So you're talking about the boundaries of the cities, the county, the unincorporated area. Then you're also talking about the where these services are provided. It gets a little more complicated because not, as Larry mentioned earlier, is not all services are just solely provided in a city limit or in the unincorporated area. These services can grow and go outside of the city limits, or the county can be providing county-wide services inside city limits. So it gets really complicated and you have to go through it service by service. The how is it going to be paid for? Where is the revenue going to come from? Who is paying for it? And this gets back to the city consternation that a lot of city residents feel on certain issues is, are they paying a tax to the city for police service? And is their tax to the county paying for a police service in the unincorporated area? And cities residents view that as double taxation. So, and that's just one example of the situation, and that's what SDS was intended to, or one of the intents of the Service Delivery Act was intended to try to address. The why, incorporated area taxpayers subsidizing unincorporated taxpayers, and vice versa. Are the unincorporated area taxpayers subsidizing city residents, or the city residents subsidizing county residents? How does that work?
So as I mentioned, the way the law was written, and it's still written this way, it only talks about cities and counties having to develop a service delivery strategy among themselves by 1999. So that's still what's on the books now, but the law does then have a statute that talks about triggers for renegotiation. They're fairly loose and flexible, as I said earlier. The language in the statute talks about, if necessary, the local governments should renegotiate in certain circumstances, and I've certainly seen disputes among parties as to whether it's necessary or not. But one of those triggers is comprehensive plans. So every 10 years, other state law requires local governments to update their comprehensive plans. There are smaller updates in the interim, but the big amendments are every 10 years. And the Department of Community Affairs has taken the position that whenever it has scheduled the update for the county's 10-year comprehensive plan update, that is also the due date for a new service delivery strategy agreement between that county and its cities. So that's the trigger that is most often used around the state. There are other triggers, such as when a new local government is created. So again, thinking back to my Fulton time, when the cities of Sandy Springs and other cities started to get created, that triggered renegotiation of service delivery strategy. It says when the existing agreement expires is a trigger, but there's no expiration date on these service delivery strategies, so that's really a trigger that doesn't have meaning in the existing law. And then again, as I mentioned, some other when necessary to change service delivery or revenue distribution arrangements. One time that a common other trigger, or at least beginning of discussions of renegotiation, often comes around when local option sales tax is renegotiated every decade after the census, because that does change some revenue distribution. And so that is logically a time that you might also want to be looking at service delivery changes. As you change the revenue mix, how should that affect the service delivery among the county and in those cities?
And one thing I'll add with that, the existing service agreements and their expiration, is Larry is absolutely right, is that there's no actual expiration. Some of these service delivery agreements might list an expiration date. Theoretically, the Constitution prohibits cities and counties from entering into IGAs of longer than 50 years. So theoretically, there would be a 50-year if you don't have something explicitly listed. But there are the triggers as well. But the bigger challenge also then becomes 50 years is a long time, y'all. 50 years ago, places like Forsyth County were providing a completely different level of service than they do today, So 50 years is a long time. But then going beyond that, who's required to participate and sign off on the SDS? Obviously the county is, because the county is the only county in every area, right? They're the only ones. But when you talk about cities, we have 537 cities in the state of Georgia. If we had to have every city sign off on the service delivery strategy, you could get bogged down significantly. So the SDS Act says that the city that serves as the county seat has to sign off. Any city with a population of 9,000 or greater has to sign off, and I wasn't around in 1997, so I don't know why they chose 9,000. 50% of the remaining municipalities with a population of at least 500 but less than 9,000. So you're capturing a lot of cities here, but you're not necessarily capturing every city.
And I also, although I'm a lot older than Rishi, I was not around at the time of this act at that point, but it looks like, and there's some similar language in the local option sales tax side, it looks like the idea was you didn't want a particularly really small local government to hold the whole process hostage, right? So you could have some very small cities that could gum up the works, and again, not to cast aspersion to cities, but I have to assume that was probably part of the reason for the language to give some flexibility that the major players could reach an agreement at some point on these kind of difficult issues. So the structure of the law, what these agreements, service delivery strategies have to include is very straightforward. You have to identify all local government services, assign which local government is providing those services and where within the county and the cities, describe how those services are funded, and then the last one, which is wordy and I don't really understand, but to identify the mechanisms for implementing the services and funding responsibilities. I would say that in practice, one of the interesting things, and this is largely a function of the flexibility I think that the law is designed to include, is that local government services aren't defined. As Rishi said, you've got supplemental power services, you've got other services that local acts and general laws allow to counties and cities. I haven't done the comparison, but I bet if you looked at all the service delivery strategies on file with the state from around the state, you might not come up with the same list of services that each county and constituent cities have come up with what they believe are the local government services that are subject to this negotiation. But again, and structurally, it's fairly succinct in the law, and the Department of Community Affairs has developed a series of forms. And there's basically a one-page form for each service. Identify the service, identify who's providing it, where they're providing it, how they're funding it. So again, in concept, it's, if not always in practice, the structure is fairly straightforward.
The last thing I want to add about those forms is DCA does provide those forms, and you would have to ask DCA, but from our experience and from state law, DCA has no desire to provide enforceability on anything that's written in those forms. They take those forms and file them, basically.
And that is also part of, that's actually in the statute, that DCA is required to verify that the components that are listed that I mentioned earlier are in there, but it doesn't, the DCA is not looking to qualitatively decide whether this is a good agreement or bad agreement. They are checking boxes.
So tagging out for a minute, so Rushi and Larry have done a great job going through the history of these issues and the Service Delivery Strategy Act that came into effect in 1997. So prior to that 97 act, as was mentioned by Rushi, city residents had started to recognize and complaining to their city officials about the fact that they were, in their estimation, being double taxed. And so this is an issue that started to be talked about a lot in the late 70s. It generated some of the conversation that ultimately led to the Service Delivery Strategy Act. There are a couple of related issues, though. One related issue is we talked about efficiency, and we talked about trying to provide services most efficiently to the taxpayer. That's an issue of duplication of services. There's no reason, if you've got cities and counties both in the water business, for them to both run parallel water lines down the same road. That's a duplication of services. That's not efficient use of taxpayer resources. But on the double taxation side of the house, yes, Chairman.
Pardon me, but I believe Representative Prince has a question, or he's got his mic blinking.
More for clarification, these agreements every 10 years?
Generally every 10 years, yes, sir.
But it's not. But they can do it as needed based on.
That's correct.
What's going on? Okay,
yep,
I'm sorry.
That's correct.
Sorry for that.
No, thank you. And
Is it since there's no statutory trigger, so there's no time limit, there's no expiration on the agreements, the biggest issue is lost? Is that fair? Unfair?
So, comp planning. I think under the real trigger is DCA's comp planning cycle. That's right. But with the double taxation, as I mentioned preliminarily, that we have cities and counties at the table. Rushi and Larry talked about who's required to be at the table in terms of the governing authorities of the county, as well as the larger cities and majority of the smaller cities. Who's not at the table, of course, is the individual taxpayer. But the individual taxpayer is, if you put it in their perspective, their interest, particularly for city residents, is not being taxed twice for the same service. So Larry alluded to, I think, the fire districts, and that's probably one of the most common ways that cities and counties have resolved that issue, is if you have a city resident, they're paying taxes for the fire department. The unincorporated residents are paying in a special tax district many times to fund the fire department. Now, we all know that under mutual aid agreements, both fire departments are going to respond, but as a general rule, there's one fire department that's serving the city, one that's serving the unincorporated area, and so many of our cities and counties have worked that out. But that model doesn't work everywhere, because not every county has a fire department. Not every not all cities do. Sometimes the counties provide fire services for the city. So you can't we're going to make some general statements today that for every general statement, there are a dozen exceptions out there because of the complexity of Georgia, right? I mean, we've talked about the diversity of the state, but the issue is that if you're an individual resident, you should not be paying taxes twice for the same service. That's the city's position. There are some particular issues where that comes into the play, but as a general statement of tax equity, it's that city taxes should be used to pay for city services, that unincorporated area revenues be used to pay for unincorporated area services, and that when there are county-wide services, and many times there are county-wide services, there are dozens, Clint can go through the list, there are dozens of services that are provided on a county-wide basis, that's an appropriate use for county-wide services. Now, that's something that's easy to state in theory, but again, when you start applying it on the ground, what is a service? We talked about a minute ago the list of services in the Supplemental Powers Law, but there are other lists of services out there. Do you split services? One thing that sometimes we hear from cities is that sometimes services are lumped together under one large category, but another county or another city might break those out into different levels, right? Is sanitation all curbside sanitation as well as recycling, or should that be two separate services? There's nothing in law that requires that to be combined or separated. But these are issues, again, that make sense to be talked about, not necessarily here in Atlanta, but make sense to be talked about in the individual context of the county with the right players at the table to figure out what is the appropriate and reasonable strategy in that particular community. Where GMA and our cities are concerned about the failure of tax equity is when countywide taxes are used to fund unincorporated area services. So that's when the city residents are paying twice. They're paying both for the service inside the city with their city taxes, and they're paying to fund services that are only being used or benefiting the unincorporated area with their countywide services. And so that's the issue that was, as Georgia has grown and as Georgia has become more complicated, the old model, which I was mayor of LaGrange before I came to work for GMA, LaGrange in Troup County was an example of a community where you had the county seat, which was the large city, and then you had a mostly rural and undeveloped, unincorporated area. I think that's the model that was common in the 60s and 70s. That's not necessarily the model that's common today. Clint living in Cherokee County, Cobb, Gwinnett, Columbia, many of these counties are highly municipalized in the sense of providing a lot of services that historically would have been provided by the cities, now are being provided by the county. You have, where we sit in Fulton County, you have a county that's essentially entirely incorporated now. And there's only a small fraction of Fulton County that has not been included inside of a city. Just to the north, though, in Forsyth, someone mentioned, in Forsyth County, you have a very large and highly developed county with a very small city population. It's a mostly unincorporated population. So I share all that to say some of these issues are the same regardless of where you go across the state, trying to make sure that the appropriate people are funding the services, but you can't necessarily cast just a blanket rule across the state because each one of those individual contexts varies. Some of the services that GMA tends to talk about as being inequitable, I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but these are some of the concerns that we hear from our cities, is that when the countywide taxes are being used to fund the sheriff, because that's one function, but yet sometimes they're not, the sheriff is not patrolling inside the city, right? So that's an issue. Fire service we've talked about sanitation. Some of these services where, for example, in a sanitation context, the city may have curbside sanitation pickup that's being paid for by city residents through fees or taxes, and then they're also funding unincorporated convenience centers and collection sites, which city residents theoretically can use, but as a practical matter would have no reason to use. So these are some individual context issues. We're not going to probably go deep into the county roads discussion because we know that's subject of litigation, but these are some of the concerns that city residents have shared about what are equitable or inequitable services. Well, do you want to add here, or you want to go ahead? Okay, all right. So the litigation issue that some of you may have heard about that is currently before the Georgia Supreme Court is an interpretation of the Service Delivery Strategy Act, because the Service Delivery Strategy Act includes language that says, in response to some of these concerns that we've talked about, that the strategy, quote, shall ensure that the cost of any service which a county provides primarily for the benefit of the unincorporated area shall be borne by the unincorporated area residents, individuals, and property owners who receive the service. And then it goes on to specify where that funding, that quote, funding shall be derived. This language is in dispute between the city of Winder and Barrow County. It was heard at the trial court level where the county prevailed. It was heard at the Court of Appeals level where the county prevailed in a 2-1 decision. And now the Georgia Supreme Court has granted the writ of certiorari. Briefing is complete. Oral argument is scheduled for October, and then it will be a ruling on that at some point, probably after the first of the year. That particular issue relates to a dispute in part over roads, which I alluded to, where the question is, should there be a distinction between county-wide roads and roads that primarily benefit the unincorporated area? Obviously, I'm not going to get into any of the litigation there, but that's the fundamental issue that is in dispute. Again, it's a double taxation argument on behalf of the city of Winder.
So, as you've heard, there's always the analysis of, is this a service that's primarily for the benefit of the unincorporated area, but somehow the counties are not paying for it out of unincorporated revenues, they're paying for it out of county-wide revenues, which city residents contribute to. The flip side of that is, in some situations, there are unincorporated revenues, again, collected only in the unincorporated area, that get put in the county's general fund to pay for all countywide services. So that's the flip. Unincorporated revenues being used to pay for countywide services. Ideally, we want to line these things up, right? We want the unincorporated residents to be paying for services that primarily benefit the unincorporated area, but we also want their funding that comes just from their unincorporated area to contribute to that. So I think we all agree that when we have unincorporated only services, the ideal way to handle it is to set up special service districts to pay for it. I think some of the resistance you see across the state in doing that is because the current law doesn't necessarily allow for them to use all those unincorporated revenues to pay for that. Therefore, they have to then create a millage rate to pay for it. And politically, you can see where you're creating a separate millage rate in the unincorporated area, and it's a brand new millage rate that nobody's ever paid before, there's some political resistance to that. So I think one thing that you all as a committee can look at is how do we align revenues and expenditures? Okay, so we got expenditures that only benefit the unincorporated area, but what revenue sources do we have that come from only the unincorporated area? So you may be asking, what are these revenues you're talking about? Well, in addition to property taxes that can be levied through special districts, we obviously have hotel motel tax that can only be collected in the unincorporated area, alcohol taxes. We have insurance premium taxes, which that one actually is handled because our Constitution dictates that can only be spent in the unincorporated area. We have cable franchise fees. We have different sales taxes. A big one is local option sales tax, and that's, I think, where local option sales tax dovetails into this conversation, because it depends on how the counties and cities are splitting that local option sales tax. How much of that split is due to countywide services versus unincorporated versus incorporated services? So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's take fire, for example. I live in a county, I can use my county because they don't have loss. They're one of the few in the state that doesn't have a loss tax. But if they did, I've received my fire service in an unincorporated service district. And by the way, they cover several other cities. So not all cities have their own fire. The county does it for the county, unincorporated area, and some of the other cities. Well, they charge a separate millage rate for that. Well, I get, if our county had loss, I'd get zero rollback on that special service fire district because the law doesn't allow for that. The law says we have to use the county share of loss on countywide rollback only. Well, if I lived in one of the cities that had fire, well, that's part of their general fund, and I would get a rollback on my fire if I lived in the city just because it's part of their general M&O levy. So if you start seeing that's the differences there between how loss is utilized to pay for countywide services, but maybe split based on a statistic that's unincorporated versus incorporated, like population is a popular one. Let's give the county a share based on their unincorporated population. Let's give the city a share based on their city population. Well, if you do it that way, it seems to be that Well, maybe you should only pay for unincorporated and incorporated services from that money, since that's the way you're splitting the money. However, the counties, because of state law, have to utilize it countywide for a countywide rollback. So again, think about unincorporated, city, countywide. And so here's some other things that so you know, sometimes there's services that disproportionately may benefit city residents. We have situations where through our 911 records, for example, we can show that per capita we have higher call volumes, maybe for EMS, which is a countywide service in a lot of counties, or for some of the other services, higher call volume inside cities. And maybe that's a function of just, again, density and some of the problems that come with people living in close proximity to one another. But there is that issue of, well, you're using countywide resources, but the primary beneficiaries, at least per capita, may be city residents. I already mentioned the local option sales tax. We call it the double dip because if you're in a city, you get that rollback on your city property taxes, but then you get the same rollback as an unincorporated resident gets on the county taxes. So you get basically two rollbacks on your total property taxes. And a lot of times the rollback you get on the city taxes, percentage-wise, is a greater amount than what you get on the county taxes. Franchise fees is another topic. So in Georgia, counties can get the cable franchise fee, and so can cities. We only get cable franchise fees based on cable services in the unincorporated area. Cities get it inside the city. But on all the other franchise fees, only cities collect the franchise fees. So when you talk about natural gas and electricity, those types of franchise fees, you can't collect, counties don't get any of those franchise fees. However, in some places, the utilities have built it into their rate base. And guess where their rate map is? It covers both incorporated and unincorporated areas. And so in a sense, if you live in an unincorporated area, you may very well be paying a franchise fee to the city. It could be through your electric bill, through your gas bill. And so that's an example of an unincorporated resident actually paying taxes that don't go to the unincorporated area. They actually go to a city. Unincorporated revenues placed in the countywide general fund. I've already mentioned that. And there's a long list of, and we can get you a list of the revenues that should only be collected in the unincorporated area, but in many cases go into the general fund. Another thing that's unique that you need to look at is, although counties and cities can provide some utility services, traditionally you won't see counties, we have counties that do water and sewer, but when it comes to natural gas and electricity, those tend to be more services that some cities will provide. And those are big money makers. Those are very profitable services. And you'll see a lot of times a transfer out of the enterprise, we call it an enterprise fund. And the reason it's an enterprise fund for you accountants up there is because we account for it differently than government services, because those are actually more like private sector services. You're paying a fee and you're getting a service, and in a sense they can be profitable. And so sometimes you'll see transfers out of the enterprise fund over into the general fund. Well, that may be appropriate because some of the overhead for providing that electric utility or gas utility is being provided under the general fund, and so it's a way to compensate for some of that overhead. Or it could be just a subsidy where you're making a lot of money off your enterprise fund, so then you peel off some of the profit and you stick it in the general fund to pay for police and fire and all these other things that are governmental services, because politically that's much easier to pay for it through a enterprise fee than have to charge a property tax for it. And so in that situation, what you've really done is you've embedded a hidden tax in the utility fee that's not all going back to the utility system. Some of that money is actually supporting the general governmental services like fire and police. And so that would, and you may be thinking, well, where does this come in the context of service delivery? Well, remember, cities can provide some of these services outside the city boundaries. So if they're providing, let's say, water service out in the unincorporated area, and let's say they charge a higher rate in the unincorporated area, maybe it's 2 times what they charge inside the city. Well, that could be justified if it really costs them 2 times as much to provide the service out in the unincorporated area. But what if it doesn't? What if some of that money is just going into the general fund to help provide an offset for city services? And that's a situation then where an unincorporated resident through their water bill is in a sense paying taxes through their water bill to fund city services. So again, I know we're throwing a lot at you, but it is very complex when you get into the nuances of who's paying what and what services are being provided where. So those are some of the other tax equity issues that come up in service delivery negotiations. So it's not always just countywide revenues being used for unincorporated services. Many times it's the unincorporated residents' revenues going countywide, or the unincorporated residents indirectly paying maybe to the city through franchise fees and utility bills.
And early on, I think Clint made reference to in some situations, and I think that's important because all these situations are different, and we know that from across the state. Not only are the issues variable, but the solutions sometimes do vary. So one of the issues that we've talked about is roads, and what are roads being funded out of countywide revenue, even though they primarily benefit the unincorporated area residents. And so the hypothetical scenario is, I think everybody recognizes that roads inside the city limits are generally paid for by city property taxes, the city revenues. The roads in the unincorporated area are generally paid for across the state, although there are exceptions, are generally paid for out of countywide revenue. And city residents would make the observation that there are unincorporated roads, there are roads in the unincorporated area that clearly have a countywide benefit. They connect cities together. They connect one city to the neighboring county. They provide means of ingress and egress. Those are countywide roads. You might call them arterial, you might call them collector roads. Clearly they have countywide benefit. But there are also subdivision roads in the county that are cul-de-sac roads that the only people who ever go down them may in fact be the residents of that unincorporated area. So it's hard, as a practical matter, it's hard to say that's a road of countywide significance. And so under current law, back to my earlier observation about splitting services, under current law, generally the counties treat road maintenance as one service. They don't drill down inside of that and determine which of those roads that are being maintained have a countywide benefit and which are primarily for the benefit of the unincorporated area. This is an issue that is often discussed at the local level among county and city officials. Here's my point. The solutions are as varied as the problem, because in some counties, when the counties sit down and talk with their city officials about this issue of roads, they recognize that there is an inequity here. They recognize there is a concern, a legitimate people of good faith sitting down in their context, recognizing there is an issue here. And so some counties have actually gone through the exercise of trying to figure out how to distinguish between countywide and unincorporated only roads. That's a complicated, difficult exercise to go through. What I think is more common is that oftentimes a county will write what you might call a tax equity check. So the county might write a check to the city to help offset this inequity. Sometimes the counties might agree by intergovernmental agreement to come into the city and help maintain city roads. That's often done. That was done in the case of LaGrange and Troup County, where the county would come in and resurface roads that were clearly city roads. And then sometimes the counties will provide a differential rollback or a differential tax rollback. So there are other ways to solve this, but back to the key point that I started with, what's required is that people of good faith come together, sit down at the table, and be reasonable to try and reach resolution. And then the one thing we lack right now is a meaningful dispute resolution process other than litigation, which can be, as we've seen in the case of Winder and Barrow County, protracted and time-consuming and expensive. But these are the issues that I think we hear recurringly from cities as it relates to roads.
Yeah, this, as Jim said, this is one of the big sticking points in these negotiations is over roads. if you look historically, and I think somebody mentioned this, the county commissioners used to be called the Roads and Revenue, Commissioners of Roads and Revenue. So there's a long history there with counties providing roads, and a lot of times they provided roads inside the cities and still do today. And so we're different across the state as far as the degree that a county may or may not be providing roads within the city limits. We still have a good number where they do provide a number, whether it's financial support or actually paving roads inside the city. There's a lot of counties that still do that. If you look across the United States with our peers, we've talked to them about this issue, and it's common that counties typically pay for their roads out of countywide revenue, so we're not unique there in paying for our roads countywide. I think the challenge is if you get into sort of splitting a service, and this is a service, and how do you determine based on use, benefit, or geography whether it's who should be paying for it. Obviously, geography is easy as far as where we're providing the roads. Use and benefit gets a little tougher, and here's what I mean by that. As far as use of a road, there's obviously city residents use county roads to get in and out of the city, but there's a lot of county roads that they may use, say, on the weekend to get to recreational. I know in the county that I used to live in, we had a boat ramp on the river that everybody went to on the weekends. Well, there was a lot of city residents using that road, and it dead ended at the boat ramp, right? So nobody else would go there except if you're going to the boat ramp. And so that's more of a use, and we don't have a way to track like who's using which roads on a daily basis. We don't. That would cost a lot of money to try to track people that way. I don't think people want us tracking them. And then the other thing is a benefit test, because we've got maybe some roads that city residents would never use, but clearly benefit the local economy. So I'm going to go to some of you that represent some of the rural counties in the state. As you all know, your agriculture is probably your number one industry. And if agriculture dried up overnight, you probably wouldn't even have a city anymore, right? If you did away with ag, there wouldn't be no reason to have a city. And so if you look at like some of the dirt roads out in the unincorporated area of the county, well, maybe city residents don't go on those dirt roads, but guess who does use those dirt roads on a daily basis? Your farmers. The tractors driving up and down those roads. And they use it because that's your number one industry. And so there's clearly a benefit to having that industry out there in the unincorporated area to those residents in the city, because nobody would be shopping in their stores if you didn't have farmers out there. And so I think that's more of a benefit test versus a use test. And so that's where it gets complicated if you get into the weeds and start trying to drill down and say, okay, how should we fund this road? Out of countywide revenues or just unincorporated revenues? You're going to get into those types of real nuances and discussions across the state in every individual place, which, again, that's y'all have to determine what the framework is. But historically, we've treated these things as sort of single services, and you kind of decide as the service as a whole, does it have a countywide benefit or an unincorporated benefit? We really haven't gotten into, up to this point, sort of splitting out these services and saying, okay, these roads are countywide, but these roads are not.
And just the last comment on the roads issue is that, of course, city residents are paying for the roads inside the city. They're also being used by unincorporated residents. They're being used, people coming into town for shop, work, whatever, come to the hospital. And so they're not paying for those currently, but unless they are a city resident. The sheriffs we talked about briefly, but this is really also about all of the constitutional services. They again, if you split out the sheriff's service, we recognize that he or she has a countywide responsibility, but sometimes our cities, particularly not so much the county seat, because typically the county seat has a lot of court services, and so a lot of times the sheriffs are in fact seen inside the cities, but some of our more rural cities have observed that they rarely, if ever, see a sheriff's deputy on patrol, even though they're paying for that service.
Last thing on sheriffs, obviously they're constitutional officers, but they do have countywide, not only countywide, but statewide arrest authority, so they can arrest and write citations inside the city just as well as in the unincorporated area. But yeah, it's the law enforcement function, the patrol function, that tends to be one of the contentious things in the SDS negotiations.
And the good thing about having local officials sitting around the table and having these conversations in their individual context is they actually know what's actually happening on the ground. They're not just talking about what's theoretically possible, but they're talking about what is actually occurring in their individual county, in their individual city. 911 is generally a county service.
So I think the issue with 911 is the difference between answering a 911 call and doing what we call dispatch services. So a lot of our counties have gone to the model where they take the 911 call and they dispatch the calls regardless of whether it's a city police officer or a sheriff's deputy. Other places, they take the call and they transfer it, say in the situation of it going to a city police department, they'll transfer it to the city, and then the city dispatches it out to their officers. So it's 911 in most of these places is clearly countywide, but it's the dispatch services that may or may not be countywide.
I think in the interest of time, we will probably skip through some of the service delivery documentation. This is really more processed through DCA, where DCA actually requires forms to be filled out and signed off on by all of the local governments that Rushi and Larry talk to. Some of the best practices in that are to have obviously correctly filled out forms, but I think DCA encourages maps for service delivery, so that you do have a geographic area. For example, on water and sewer, this is not required by law, but DCA likes to see a map of knowing where the water area for the city is going to be, where the area for the county is, et cetera. And obviously, I think Clinton and I both GMA and ACCG encourage intergovernmental agreements between cities and counties when services are going to be provided. Those forms get filed with DCA. DCA, as you will hear if you hear from them, they do not. They're not considered an enforcement agency. They're not policing the forms. They're wanting to make sure that the forms are completed correctly and signed by the right officials. But they're not weighing in on the policy decisions. Again, they're allowing that flexible framework for each county and the cities that it has in their location to be to have flexibility at the local level. Do we want, Mr. Chairman, I know we're way over on time. We can hold some of the comments about dispute resolution process to a subsequent meeting, if you would like for us to. Or
I think that'd be appropriate.
Okay.
My goal was to have us adjourned by 3 o'clock today, so we can get out there in the middle of traffic. We didn't want to miss that traffic.
Yeah.
But for me, if you wrap up just a little bit here, really what our committee is tasked with is where do we go forward. Now I can tell you, as the guys that have these badges on that say legislator on them, they don't want us to resolve that issue. I know I was at a meeting they had with both the policy meeting where ACCG and GMA were there. Somebody spouted off, well, it ought to be the legislature that fixes it. I suggested that they not do that, and said that it should be one that if we can get these two agencies together to come to a meeting of the minds, we can put it into statute. It is our job as a study committee to look at where we want to go on recommendations and kind of help steer them in that regard. So that's why our function is I do know that I have DCA scheduled for our third meeting, and hopefully that's our third and final meeting. Our next meeting will be in Valdosta. We'll have a good program there. We've got a meeting in Brazelton. The Mayor Ward is going to take care of us on it. I have a question on mic number 3. Is that
just
you?
a quick one. If we're not going to go over the dispute resolution slides, is there something you guys could also provide that's supplementary material that sort of lays out what you intended to discuss on that?
So I know on the dispute resolution, and that's key, GMA and HG have put together a working group, and we're meeting regularly. We've had, 4 or 5 meetings already. And we're looking at not just SDS disputes, but lost local option sales tax disputes as well, and trying to come up with a process that could resolve disputes for both of those in a very similar manner. We're not ready to bring that to this committee yet. We hope to maybe by the second or third meeting. So we're still working out some of those details. But under current law, when there's a dispute, obviously there's facilitators, mediators that get involved, but at the end of the day, a lot of these disputes wind up in court. We've already mentioned some litigation that's ongoing right now on SDS that's in court, and that gets very costly when you have to take this litigation into the courts and pay for all the attorneys to litigate it. And so we're trying to find solutions to keep people out of court, I think, is the bottom line. But we'll be bringing that at a future meeting.
Clint and Jim, could you talk to us a little bit about what happens when SDS issues go unresolved? Is there any
Yeah,
consequence to the cities and counties?
Yes. So at the end of the day, we talked about who has to sign the agreement. But if the required parties to sign don't sign, then everybody, whether you feel like you're the at-fault party or not, doesn't matter. Everybody gets, in a sense, penalized. And the penalty is you lose your state grants, permits, grants and permits. But that can be the permits actually can be more significant sometimes than the grants. When you think about grants, though, I mean, we get LMIG dollars. That's a big grant for roads. When you think about permits to run your radar, we have to get those from the state. I know permits to expand water capacity come from the state. Financial assistance from GFA. So it's actually a pretty heavy hammer when you think about losing your grants and permits from the state of Georgia. So DCA is in charge of having to notify these agencies that you're not in compliance and to withhold the grants and permits. Now, there is an out there. If you're under the courts can basically, I don't know, Rishi, you're the attorney, they can basically stay or stay those penalties while you're in court, right? And so we have had some situations, I think, where we've had some counties and cities that have been in SDS under a court order for quite some time, so the penalties haven't applied to them. Is that correct?
We'll see if we can remedy that. Said Representative Washburn, you have a question?
Yes, sir. I was curious about that last little segment about the grants. Is that usually equally as painful to the cities and the counties, or can it be heavily weighted one way or the other?
I think it just depends on the area and what they need and where they're at in their time frame applying for these things. Because I've heard situations where it was more painful to the city and other places where it was more painful to the county. It just kind of depends.
Yeah, one follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So obviously one or the other could have the upper hand in the waiting for a resolution of the dispute then.
Right.
And so, yes, I think one of the when we come back to see you at a future meeting, one of the things we will probably talk in some detail about is dispute resolution, because we do think that's an area that that GMA and ACCG probably are together own and can make some recommendations. Just briefly, was alluded to, we do have a task force that's currently meeting. Of course, Chairman Dockery served on a previous version of a SDS loss task force, as did I when I was elected official. We started this in 2019. COVID hit in 2020, and that work was suspended. We have recommenced that work with a different task force, but one of the big things we're trying to do is come up with a better dispute resolution process, something that avoids the protracted litigation. That task force is currently meeting. The slide shows who the members are, so it's Mayors John Reed from Eaton and Rusty Paul from Sandy Springs, as well as City Manager Cletus Phillips from Noonan, and then 3 county chairmen, Dave Carmichael from Paulding, Shannon Whitfield from Walker, and Travis Turner from White. They made a joint presentation to the GMA ACCG policy councils, as Chairman Ginn alluded to in LaGrange last week. That task force is going to reconvene later in October to try and finalize some of those recommendations. At this point, I think we'll see if there are any other questions, and apologize for going over the time allotment.
Seeing no other questions, we'll move on to our next speaker. Said appreciate that great history lesson and kind of bring us up to speed. So the next on our agenda, I think we've got a recovering Attorney General, former county commissioner, and as they say in the world of politics, one of those silk stocking lawyers. Said could we ask Sam Owens to step forward and Sam, if you can kind of keep into the plan of we've got about 30 minutes between now and time we adjourn, and we've got one follow up and after you.
I am more than happy to not bore you. And I don't have a PowerPoint. And thank you very much for the opportunity, I think, to come here today to talk with you all. Let me just start by saying when I was an elected local government official, county commissioner, county chair, what you saw here would have never happened. You would not have had GMA and ACCG within 30 feet of each other. And I think that they have made huge strides to work together, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. This whole area well, complex and comprehensive. And might I say, we could all use a big cup of coffee at this point. More's going to get resolved by them coming to you with solutions than y'all as legislators trying to fashion a solution. The last thing I think you should try and do is the latter step, because they know the issues day in and day out, and they know how best to make the issue work better. So first, my background. So I took office as a county official in '90. At that time, we were doing 30-day extensions with DCA because we were not compliant with House Bill 489, the Service Delivery Act. When I was chair, 3 years later, is when we finally resolved the Service Delivery Act between the cities and Cobb and the county. It was not a quick process. And then as you noted, used to be Attorney General. I've represented cities and counties since joining Denton's, as well as at times being on the other side of that picture, as Chairman Ginn is very familiar with. That was an issue that concerned a doctor's practice that wanted to open up. The water service was provided by the city. The county at the time had a policy that you had to not seek annexation for 5 years, or they would not be kind to you. Such a document had been signed earlier, and all these folks wanted to do was open up a doctor's practice. I would say that the conclusion to that mess was, frankly, Senator Ginn talking to both parties and getting them to become reasonable in resolving the issue. And I think sometimes that's really the most important lesson. This is all about good faith. And sometimes legislators can frankly go back to their local elected officials and push them to find that good faith. And I think to the extent any of you have that inclination, I would strongly encourage it, because y'all are in a position to help because they need you for other issues. So by you helping resolve some of these issues, you're also in a position to help them thereafter on issues important to them. When I was Attorney General, a case came out, Turner County versus City of Ashburn. That was a case that found baseball arbitration unconstitutional. I remember Larry Hansen immediately called me and said, hey, this is a real big problem. Larry's the head of GMA. He said, this is a real big problem with your past experience. We want to meet in the AG's office, and we want a short-term resolution with cities and counties, and then to work together for the next legislative session to solve it. I was happy for our office to do that. We did do it. In the next legislative session, there was a resolution. I'm not 100% sure the Turner County case was decided accurately, but that's a different decision. I don't frankly think there can be separation of powers issues between cities and counties. I think separation of powers relates to the state of Georgia and local governments and the federal government and states. Having said that, that's what makes litigation. Thereafter, from the 2013 case, there was the Union Point case in 2018, the Barrow County case that had been cited earlier, where they'll have oral argument next month. If you look at the code section that seems to be one of the biggest parts of the Winder-Barrow County, it's 3670-24-3A, which inartfully states, the strategy shall ensure that the cost of any service which a county provides primarily for the benefit of the unincorporated area of the county shall be borne by the unincorporated area residents. That sentence doesn't make sense. As has been stated by both representatives of GMA and ACCG, a simple sentence like that doesn't work in 159 counties and 800 somewhat cities. By definition, every county's different. Cities are different. If it's a city that's 90% of the population of the county versus a city that's 10% of the population of the county, language like that candidly isn't helpful. Query whether geography is as important as the use. The people who use that park, that road, that facility. Geography alone is an artificial construct that rarely is helpful in service delivery issues. The biggest issue facing us today is what happens in that Winder-Barrow County case. If the two sides don't resolve the issue before the Georgia Supreme Court rules, then you're going to have a situation where the cities and counties are going to arch their back based on that decision. So I would strongly encourage both sides of that case to resolve pre a decision by the Georgia Supreme Court. Right now, you have the cities and the counties for the last several years working very well, constructively together. That decision could really hinder that cooperation. So I would certainly encourage both sides. I think, Senator, you know both sides there. Generally people always say, I can't wait for the court to decide. And then when the court decides, you really wish you never said, I can't wait for the court to decide. Whenever two parties can decide themselves, they may not be happy with the result, but they know the result and they could move thereafter. In summary, land use special districts, taxation, water rates, and the like all require reasonable elected officials on all sides of SDS issues. Statutory amendments may worsen the current political environment. Counties throughout the state are as different can be. The quality of roads, access to general aviation, airports, broadband availability, healthcare facilities, etc., vary throughout our state. One-size-fits-all language in service delivery agreements generally is not good policy. Guardrails should seek to bring the parties closer together, not to dictate results that harm both sides years later. So in a final sentence, I would suggest to you that letting ACCG and GMA potentially come forward to you with a resolution would be the best thing you could do, would be the best thing for the cities and counties. And now that doesn't mean that you might want to put a little fire on them to come to that resolution, but that's going to be far better than a legislative fix that doesn't have their support, as that is so important. And once again, I want to thank you for your assistance. I think I have kept both chairmen to a reduced schedule, so you have time for your last speaker. Clearly, if you have a question, I'll answer it. If not, I'll be happy to let you get to your last speaker.
Chairman LaHood.
Are there any questions for Mr. Olens from the committee? All right, hear none. Thank you, Mr. Olens. Appreciate it.
Thank you much. Thanks for your experience.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Doug Ives, if you'll come on up. And just tell us who you are, your background, and what you'd like to share with us today.
Thank you.
And I've already promised them 3 o'clock, so you got 20 minutes.
Thank you. Two things. I do talk fast, and I will, thanks to the great presentation by the GMA and the ACCG, I'll be able to skip some of my slides. My name is Doug Eves. I run Eves Consulting Group. I've been in the trenches with cities and counties for the past 12, 13 years doing service delivery negotiations and tax equity studies. I'm a recovering county manager and chief financial officer. So I dealt with that for almost 10 years as a county manager, and then for the past 13 years as a consultant doing tax equity studies. I apologize for the allergies that have hurt my throat, but I will muddle through. Thank you for allowing me to be here today to talk about some of the issues and concerns that are facing the cities and counties that we've had to address over the past 23 years. City and county relationships are being harmed by unnecessarily contentious SDS negotiations. The process that's been established was rather straightforward, with a set of components and a set of criteria that had to be met in developing the SDS. And as the GMA then noted, it's been working fairly well for the past. We've had a few hiccups along the way. And that conflict primarily centers around a misunderstanding, as has been mentioned, about what is the primary benefit clause and how are those services to be funded. They've talked about Amendment 19, and I'm not going to go through all of the history of Amendment 19, But it is critical to remember that Georgia is a Dillon state, and counties only have the powers that they were given by the Constitution or by statute. They were able to perform those.
Destination ATIS is 1-2.
As the counties grew, especially during the Eisenhower Parkway, the interstates, and the just the growth from municipal areas out into the unincorporated area, the need for services changed, and there was a raft of LGAs that were requested for urbanized type services. The General Assembly got tired of all those LGAs and put in place Amendment 19 that authorized 15 at the time, but ended up being 14 when it was put into the Constitution, of enumerated type services, of municipal type services that were in addition to and supplemental of all powers already possessed. That was the original law. That's enshrined in the Georgia Constitution, and that did result in competition and conflict, and on occasion, taxpayers paying twice for the same service. That was the evil. The Georgia Futures Communities Commission was appointed by the governor and the General Assembly to help address issues impacting economic growth in the state. The commission put forth they recognized Amendment 19 was a problem, and they recommended the Service Delivery Strategies Act to eliminate those concerns. That was the remedy that was put forward and adopted by the General Assembly. The legislative intent, and I apologize as I'm going so fast, but I'm trying to live up to your 3 o'clock commitment, sir. Well, the intent was to minimize inefficiencies, avoid competition, and to provide a mechanism to resolve disputes, because they recognized that with 159 counties, that there was no one-size-fits-all approach would work. They put into place 4 components, and these are critical because these are current and they are working. Identification of all local government services, an assignment of who, and most importantly, where those services will be provided. That's the geographical component that the General Assembly put in place. That only addresses where the services are going to be performed by what party. It describes the funding sources and identify the mechanisms, the contracts, the IGAs, or the ordinances that were going to be provided to fund those services. Now the criteria, there were 4. One dealt with the overlap, competition, duplication. One dealt with the extraterritorial provision of water and sewer, and ensure that those rates would be reasonable and non-arbitrary. Criteria 3 is the one that's been causing the most conflict. Part A says they ensure the cost of any service provided primarily for the benefit of the incorporated area shall be borne by the residents. This is the second part of the equation. First, you identify where the service is going to be performed. That's geographical location. Then, for it to be funded by unincorporated type services, then you had to make a second test, a second determination, which was, is that service, even though it's in the unincorporated area, primarily only benefit the unincorporated area, or can it have countywide impact? Provision B said that it should be funded from a special service district with property taxes, insurance premium taxes, assessments, and user fees. And of course, criteria 4 was land use plans, compatible and non-conflicting. The conflict centers on primary benefit services. What type of services primarily benefit the unincorporated area? Roads has been the major point of contention. Sheriff's Patrol, that's been exempted as are constitutional officer services. Constitutional officers are not part of the local government services, so they've been exempted. We do agree with the fire, the solid waste, planning and zoning, building permits and inspections, and animal controls. Now, animal controls, some of these can be provided countywide by agreement, but if those services are provided in the cities by the county, you have to have an IGA in place to do so. And then there were questions about the funding sources. Are only the directly enumerated revenues available? Property taxes, insurance premium taxes, assessments. And what is meant by assessments? Is it the assessments of property taxes, or is it the assessments of excise taxes? on alcohol, cable franchise taxes, license fees. Are those to be included? Because those are exclusive to the unincorporated area. And if the county cannot use those to fund unincorporated services, where are they going to use those unincorporated restricted revenues? If they're required to use them in the general fund, which is one of the proposals as it come out in the Winder case, then that provides a tax inequity because the unincorporated citizen is paying a fee or a tax that is being used to reduce the tax burden of the incorporated resident because it's reducing the countywide millage rate. And that's unfair to the unincorporated resident that's paying those fees. The city has their share of those cable franchise fees, excise taxes, and alcohol taxes that they can use for their general M&O. The county should be able to use those to fund the municipal type services in the unincorporated area. If not, you have uniformity issues. One issue that needs to be clarified is in 2020, the state in House Bill 779 set up a base rate of 23% for the TAVT for the incorporated area. The city's got the remaining 28% of the local government's 51% share. In the unincorporated area, the county gets the full 51%. There's a 28% discrepancy there between what this county gets from the incorporated area and from the unincorporated area. That money should be available, the 28% that goes to the county from the unincorporated area should be available to fund unincorporated type services. If not, what you end up with is TAVT from the incorporated area, the 23% funding countywide services, where the county and the unincorporated is paying the full 51%. So there's an inequity there. That needs to be, there's a 23% base rate, and the 28% differential is being able to be used for unincorporated services. Just like the city could use their 28% for municipal type services within the city limits, the county can use their 28% for municipal services in the special service districts of the county. That would be a good point of clarification for this committee to look at and to address. The biggest part of this, and we've all talked about, is compromise and consensus. In 1997, after the House Bill 49 was passed, the DCA, the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, the ACCG, and the GMA came together and drafted an implementation manual based upon the act that was put in place and the compromises, the consensus that had gone into the drafting of House Bill 489. That's been published on the official DCA website and as Appendix B to the official Georgia Future Communities report to the General Assembly. That clarifies the two issues that have been addressed. It says some county services are made available countywide, including indigent defense, county roads in the incorporated and unincorporated areas, and should be paid out of the county general fund. That was in 1997 and revised in 2002 and authored by the ACCG, GMA, the DCA as the government agency for the state, and the CVIG. And it says what type of revenues are be able to be used. And it talked about not just the enumerated, but special district property taxes, business occupation taxes, and alcohol taxes. In 1997, the spirit of cooperation, collaboration, and compromise set the tone for what this committee should look at is when you're being asked to make changes. The concessions have been made, the compromises have been reached.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
I want to be careful here because I want GMA might need to speak to this, and so ACCG as well, because that's just one excerpt from the collaborative effort of those two organizations. Later on in that document, it says, does this mean that roads are not a point of discussion for service delivery? And it says, capital letters, no, it is. So I want to make sure this committee understands that that paragraph that you just read is a little out of context, that it does go on to say how you spend those monies within the area is important to service delivery. Just want to make that clarification because the indication you gave there from that document that they collaborated, and I'll let you respond to that as the attorney, that it's already been ruled that GMA and ACCG considered the roads to be paid from general fund. That is not true from that document.
Well, to be clarified, a point of clarification is the paragraph that you're talking about later on specified that for the points of discussion would be how the county would handle the county roads that were in the incorporated area of the county. That was the paragraph that you're referring to, said that it is a legitimate point of discussion for the county and the cities to discuss what would happen with the county roads that extended inside the city limits. That's what that paragraph is referring to.
Well, I beg to differ, but I'll let Jim answer that one.
I'm just quoting from the manual, that's all.
That's not an exact quote, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, it's not, but it's a pretty close paraphrase.
We're going to move on.
Oh, yes, sir, thank you.
But
then big, yes, sir.
Less than 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Make sure you can tell Tom.
I'm going as fast as I can, but yes, sir, I'll try to complete. The biggest issue is conflation of primary benefits clause. Supplementary powers are geographically restricted, but do not address benefits. The courts have held in DeKalb versus Decatur that county that unincorporated services, or that services are in the unincorporated areas such as park and recreations and county roads, can have countywide benefit. And Mr. Burgess, the former GMA director, made very clear in the 1983 committee to revise the 1983 Constitution that city residents use county roads and county facilities and enjoy the benefit of those services, especially the Fulton County Skeet Range where he'd love to go shoot. Now, what are primarily benefit services? I mean, this commonality is that these services that we typically tend to agree with are services provided for the benefit of the taxpayer's property, such as solid waste, fire coverage. Services such as libraries, parks, recreation, and roads are not direct property services, but provide a more universal benefit. Now, these 3 points in the county road system are critical, and I'll skip over a lot of the other points, but I'd like to make these 3. The county road system, road maintenance is a ministerial function of the county commissioners. The commissioners are subject to mandamus for the maintenance of public roads. It is not a discretionary service. They're required to provide it. It is not part of the original evil that was created by the supplemental powers clause of the Constitution. County road maintenance preceded Amendment 19 as a responsibility of the county commissioners. And as such, the service is not one of the evils generated by Amendment 19. And again, we talk about the roads provide a countywide benefit. That was decided in DeKalb versus Decatur and Winder versus Barrow at the appellate level, and that's under appeal at the Supreme Court. I'll skip this one. The proposal that's been made up that you've heard today is that the county should take over or should continue doing interstate, freeway, arterials, and collectors as countywide road services. And they should leave the local roads as unincorporated funded roads. That would mean that 80% of the county roads, this is from the Department of Transportation 445 report, would be unincorporated services, which means 80% of the county road budget would be now charged to only the unincorporated taxpayer. When it says state, those are state totals of the county roads. So 80% of the county roads would now be considered, under their proposal, unincorporated funded revenues. In 2020, according to the Department of Community Affairs, county spent $345 million on road maintenance operations, not capital operations. That means $276 million would be now shifted to only the unincorporated residents and require a new taxation on homes, farms, and timberlands. Incorporated residents would still be able to receive the benefits without paying taxes. There would be uniformity disaster in the state. The benefits are more than usage. Clint talked about agricultural business farm gate. That's $14.7 billion worth of economic value in the state of Georgia that is coming off of these county roads from the agricultural. Timber harvesting. Internet shopping has been the #1 driver in the increase in sales tax the past several years. Those rely on county roads to deliver that shopping. The Sheriff's Patrol, just very quickly, it's exempt. The deputies have statewide jurisdiction. The fine money that they generate would now also have to transfer from the general fund to the unincorporated area, which means you would have a hole in the general fund operating that would have to be filled in with a new millage levy on a countywide basis. And the duties of the sheriff under case law cannot be relegated to a special service district. That's Chanel versus Houston. They've decided to skip the dispute resolution process. This is the current. But the key is that it requires a judge to make a decision on compliance with the elements and a legal interpretation of the legislative intent. That is a judicial function. The process is working. It provides statewide consistency. There's been some talk about resolution panels. That would promote chaos and inconsistency. It would assign a judicial power to a quasi-legislative organization. You have potential 159 different mechanisms. Now here's the key. The penalties are onerous, the way they've talked about these resolution panels. What would happen is that if one party agreed to the decision, their sanctions would be removed. If the other party felt they had a due process right to go to a court for a ruling, their sanctions would remain in place, and they would be penalized even though they felt they had a due process right to a judicial review. The original legislative intent is as valid today as it was in 1997, and I'm very close, Mr. Chairman. The existing statute should tweak available revenues for clarity, tweak the primary benefit clause. The 4 components are valid, the 4 criteria are clear, and meet the legislative intent. The recommendations, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and do not create a greater evil with a perceived and unnecessary fix. And finally, this is a critical slide, I believe. This is from the preamble to the Charting a Course for Cooperation and Collaboration, written by the DCA and the ACCG and GMA. It talks about the compromise and consensus that went into the drafting of House Bill 489 in the first place. In the preamble, it says that the concept of a service delivery negotiation and a resolution mechanism was easy to reach. The devil was in the detail. That required the ACCG and the GMA to come together and make a compromise in order for the law to go forward. They did so. That compromise is in place. That consensus was in place in 1997. It's rendered in the Charting a Course manual that you see that they put together. In late 1997, that consensus was reached. It was put in place by Representative Royal, and it was enacted. And the manual was written from that compromise and that consensus. There's no harm has been shown sufficient to cause a change in the historical compromise and the consensus that was put in place. Thank you.
Appreciate your testimony.
I have submitted to the chairman a full report with a lot of background that I submit that in addition to my PowerPoint presentation. And now we'll catch your breath.
Thank you. Senator Burns, you have a question?
A more general question, and it may need to have GMA or ACCG respond. In the last 5 years, how many disputes have gotten to the point of legal contesting, and how much has been expensed in defending those? So if there's not a problem, why are we here? And I'm just trying to understand how many disputes have gone full process. Now,
they'll bring that answer to our next meeting.
Yeah, bring that answer to our next meeting. Great idea. Thank you.
I'd like a quick response from GMA and ACCG if they agree with what the consultant is saying, that that document created a compromise that both parties agreed to, or is he misinterpreting the document possibly?
We don't fully agree with what he's saying.
I just want to make sure the panel is aware of that there is discussion about that. I know there was a brief written by GMA, and I'm not sure where ACCG is, but I mean, we agree there's probably still some reason why we're here today as a committee to find some resolution through the lost or some of the things we talked about at lunch and other times that might address it. I don't think that compromise was clearly communicated in that document. I want to make sure the committee understood that.
That's that fine print that says some opinions and expressions are not necessarily those of the rest of us. So the Chairman LaHood, I think we got our next meeting scheduled
We do. Our next meeting will be October 3rd in Valdosta, my hometown. So look forward to seeing you all there. And we waited until October, so hopefully the weather will be a little bit more tolerable. But I do look forward to seeing you there, and hope you all have safe travels there. And
The gnats will be less, and you'll have more meeting details that you'll send out to our committee and others.
Yes. I can't promise the leaves will be peaked, Chris, Dockery, but I know you're from the mountains. But yeah, we'll it'll be a good time, and we'll make sure to roll out the red carpet and show you some good South Georgia hospitality. And then the following meeting, the third meeting, will be in Chairman Ginn's district. We've got November 20th marked for that one. In Brazelton.
And at that meeting, we've kind of scheduled around the Department of Community Affairs schedule. And one of the things that it's my goal and intent here is to put some more teeth into, pushing more for that. Okay, we're going to get to an agreement instead of going to court, and whatever we got to do to give DCA those teeth. I'm hoping that we can keep you at the table and talking, or we can say, if you don't, here's the consequences. And to me, with no further questions or business, the Chairman Hood.
The meeting will be adjourned.